This is part 12 in my guide to the mechanical raid team, and I'll be looking at Aethana in this iteration, specifically the legendary 5 version of Aethana for this fight. So I made my first ever attempt at fighting Aethana as a guild raid boss today, and this is the replay of that. Initially I thought I'd just give a little off-the-cuff talk through of what I'd done and why and where things could be improved, and there's no shortage of improvements for sure. But as I collected my thoughts, I realised that this fight is actually quite a lot more nuanced than I originally thought, so now I'm doing a proper scripted thing. As usual with any scripted video I do, I'll be linking the script in the description of this video and in a comment. I'll be demonstrating what I talk about in the script via a battle replay, and so I think you may want to watch the video to get a full understanding of what I'm talking about down to the specific hexes that I'm referring to. This script may still be of some use just for any general principles I bring up though. I will be going through the battle itself after I go through all the general principles, so I'll just link a timestamp as well in the description of the video, just so you can skip past all of this blah that's already in the script and then sort of get to the actual fight, which I won't be covering in the script. Now, obviously there are more maps than this one for the boss fight, but the boss adds on this one add a layer of complexity to the fight, and as such I just want to discuss them before I get onto the boss herself, who is hardly any different than she is when faced as a normal opponent. If you know anything about AdMech fights, you know that positioning of the boss is critical, and thus being able to both predict and control accurately where a boss will end up is the most important skill to have. Any factors in the fight that could lead to inconsistency in positioning of the boss must be mitigated to the point where the inconsistency is either eliminated or becomes inconsequential to the flow of the battle. The problem I have with Harlequins in this fight is that their active ability, this one here, it allows them to attack 3 enemies before landing in a random hex adjacent to one of them. And that's the key here, random. I really hate that word. On this particular map, I wish to create a clump of units in the right-hand edge on my first turn, specifically this area here, which the Harlequins will invariably use their active abilities on. This wouldn't necessarily be a problem if I did not also desire to lure Aethana to the clump of units in order to use her active ability against them. As anyone who has faced Aethana in an arena fight or otherwise will know, she really loves to use her active ability as long as it is able to hit at least 2 foes, and for me it would be a reliable means of bringing her adjacent X to row. So if I had a line of units here, she'd perform a southern slash, jump over the 3 of them and land on this hex, so I could just leave row here, here or here to make sure that he's adjacent to her at the beginning of the next turn. Of course, if there are no empty hexes adjacent to the last enemy in a row that she would hit, then she will not be capable of using her active and instead perform a normal attack, which would scupper any plans I have of bringing her adjacent to row. So I don't want her moving into this position and then just performing a normal attack on a Skitaria standing here. Because if I have row waiting down here, then he's just going to be left high and dry. You see the description of her active ability, Swooping Hawk, lands in the hex directly behind the last target hit, or in the case that hex is occupied, to the closest free hex to it. So that implies that if there are no free hexes, then she can't use this ability, which is no good for my purposes. So one way that she may end up not having a free hex to move into after using her active is if a couple of Harlequins have randomly moved into all available hexes after using their actives. So again, if you think I have a clump of units, I'll have a Skitaris here, Tan here, Actus here and a Skitaris here. She performs her active ability, jumping over this line of 3, then she will have either this hex or this hex to land in. So if both of these hexes happen to be occupied by Harlequins, then she won't be able to do it. Now, the Guardian Eldari, they tend to keep their distance and thus are not an issue in this respect in terms of blocking her off, but the Harlequins demand to be dealt with here. Of course, dealing with the Harlequins is its own can of worms due to the sheer RNG involved in their low durability combined with their powerful 50% chance block. There is also the factor of their passive causing them to close in 1 hex on whoever attacked them, which may interfere with Tan's spawning of Skitari. So if Tan is here and he performs an attack on this Harlequin, it could move towards him, I think, before he spawns in the Skitaris, which would prevent him from spawning it onto this high ground hex and force him to instead spawn it here or here. just as an example of that. Of course, if there is nothing in the way of the Harlequin, this can also serve to bring them within range of another character that may not have been able to attack them when they were in their original position, such as Boss Golgorts in this replay. So Boss, if I move him 3 hexes, I could move him here, here, or here, which means that this Harlequin is out of range of him. But if I attack this Harlequin and it blocks and it moves to this hex, it will then be in range from any one of these hexes. So it's a way of actually opening it up to being injured more. Whatever happens, basically here, you'll need to have contingency plans in place to keep both Harlequins from attacking your units, at least if you're attempting to duplicate what I did. I assume that Harlequin would be more tempted to attack and overkill a Spore Mine than use their actives as well, but you'd have to bear in mind that Guardians seem to act before Harlequins in this fight, and thus you need to position the Spore Mine so that it is only within range of the Harlequin you wish to distract, such as by putting it in the top right-hand hex of the map in this particular replay. I wasn't sure about the turn order of the boss adds and what would get baited where in this battle, it being my first battle, and so I did not want to spawn a Spore Mine only for it to not get attacked in the first round, as extraneous Spore Mines floating around when you're trying to bait a boss to specific locations is a recipe for having a bad time. Nevertheless, I think my concern was unwarranted, and I'd make use of a Spore Mine in the first turn in the future, if necessary. Speaking of baiting the boss to specific locations, it's very important for this fight at this level. Against weaker versions of Aethana, it may be easy to keep Aethana pinned in place and just wail on her, but her boss ability is too strong to allow for such things. So let's take a look at it, the Wild Host. So it reduces all incoming damage by 66%. I won't be discussing that at the moment, but that's important, as is the fact that she loses 7,000 health each time she's attacked. What I want to focus on for the moment is that it allows her to deal 3 times 3,589 to 3,989 damage, projectile damage to every hex from which she was attacked in the preceding turn. So encouraging her to stay in place will simply mean that every one of your summons that attacks her and likewise stays in place will be rapidly reduced to goo by this ability, which will tank your damage output by lowering the number of passive attacks Ro is able to make per turn massively. What I do instead in this replay is make use of the Biovore's passive to predictably lure her all over the map, pulling summons after her and keeping them out of the line of fire as much as possible. Her flying trait means that being able to keep her hemmed in with Spore Mines is an impossibility without also carefully positioning your characters to block her movement, which is, again, impossible to do for more than one turn before they succumb to her boss ability. This presents an issue, of course, in that Ro is only able to be used to good effect if he remains adjacent to a boss. This is why I've made such a big deal out of luring Aethana adjacent to Ro in her very first turn. I can attack Aethana with all of my other characters and get a ton of triggers of Ro's passive before, as my last action of the turn, preemptively moving Ro adjacent to the hex I'll be luring her to in the following turn. The next turn she makes her move, ends up next to Ro, gets hit by him every time she is attacked by a mechanical unit, be it a summon or a character, before the process of preemptively moving Ro is once again repeated on until the end of the battle. You cannot afford to constantly be trying to play catch up with Aethana, only moving Ro adjacent to her after she is moved, as this will cost you a lot of your damage output. This business of encouraging Aethana to move around is one reason why I chose to use Boss Golgorts over Shosil. While both characters have the same range, Boss is not hampered by low mobility like Shosil is, and so is better equipped to engage in a chase. Aethana also loses a significant chunk of health every time she is attacked, so having your boys running around attacking her can be a good source of damage, outside of their ability to wipe out her adds and keep your other summons focused on the main target. Boss is able to trigger Ro twice per turn. Whilst Shosil and his drones can theoretically trigger Ro's passive more than this, their propensity to stay in place due to their long range and get killed by Aethana's boss ability may make their theoretical maximum effectiveness difficult to attain in practice. That being said, I'm not entirely sold on the addition of Vitruvius to this team. Most damage against this boss is not dealt to her directly, but rather through her health loss mechanic, at least at this level. Again, just taking a look at that again, it's 7,000 damage every time she's attacked, whilst the actual damage of your troops is reduced by 66%. I don't think the extra hits that Vitruvius adds are all that consequential, given that Ro, with 3 hits on high ground relative to Aethana, is still only predicted to deal 2,000 total damage against her per attack, or 600-ish damage for the 1 hit that Vitruvius adds to the total. On the other hand, Aethana, again, loses 7,000 health each time she's attacked, and thus Shosil may actually do better than Vitruvius here, simply by providing more attacks against Aethana, both in terms of attacks from his drones and procs of Ro's passive. I'd need to have a little more experience than just the one fight to give a definitive answer on who's the best to take here, but I feel like there are probably better options than Vitruvius. Anyway, that's all the general stuff I have to talk about, so I'm going to go through the replay now and comment on it. Let's get started. As I said, moving Tan up and getting Skitari spawned. I don't want to put him in a position where I'm just able to attack these 2 Guardians, as if I overkill one of them, the other one could flee via battle fatigue, and then I'd only be able to spawn 1 Skitarius in. And just having Tan here again was convenient to me for baiting Aethana to use her active ability. I got lucky with the overkill on the Harlequin there. Things could have gotten a lot more interesting if that Harlequin had survived. I think I would have had to put a Spore Mine bait up here to keep them both from using their active abilities on this clump of units here and potentially blocking off both of these hexes, which, as I described before, I don't want to have happen. Now, the Harlequins, their active ability, it can hit 2 additional enemies adjacent to the initial target. So I think I made a mistake by placing Boss Golgots here, because this Harlequin, it could have hit this Skitarius, hit Tan, and then hit Actus, and then landed in this hex, which would then have prevented Aethana from landing on the hex. Luckily for me, that didn't happen, but I shouldn't have blocked off this space with Golgots like I did. So now I decide to use the War just to get rid of the boss ads. I think here, because the boss isn't spawning any additional summons like some other bosses do, it's not so important to have your Orc boys spawned before your Skitari, so that they take out the boss summons rather than the Skitari getting distracted. And I think actually what I should have done here was spawn my Skitari before the boys. Just so that when it came to who gets priority of taking positions to attack the boss from, the Skitari would get to go first and get the best positions, which might end up, over the course of the fight, giving me more activations of Ro's passive, potentially. I don't think it made too much of a difference here, but something to think about. So again, just trying to get a bunch of summons out. So at this point, I've attacked Aethana from here, 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 and here. Sorry, not there, but yeah, from everywhere else. So now I want to draw all of my summons away from this area, from the danger of her boss ability, so I thought a good place to draw her to would be over here. Specifically into this, into this hex, I believe. So I could also get high grounds adjacent to her. It seems to me like the summons actually try and avoid the hexes that are about to be hit by her ability. I might be wrong on that, actually. It might have just been coincidence here, but I think probably what I should have done is lure her a bit further away to get my summons well out of the danger zone. Maybe lure her over here, perhaps, instead of here, which isn't too far for her to move. Because ultimately, Ro having high ground relative to her isn't that important, because he's really not dealing that much damage to her with his attacks anyway. What's more important is keeping my summons alive and making sure she gets attacked a lot and is getting that 7,000 health knocked off of her consistently. Yeah, high ground in comparison, it's actually not making much of a difference in terms of my damage output. So as I know from the general behaviour of the AI in this game, Aethana only had 2 hexes to attack that spore mine from. One was this one that I have selected, and one is the one that she's currently on, and I knew that she preferred to move to the high ground. So I knew that putting Ro here would make sure that he would be adjacent to her at the start of this turn. Things are getting a bit cluttered, so I'm just going to spawn 1 Skitaris and then switch over to Conqueror mode to get a few extra hits, rather than trying to mess around and spawn in extra Skitari, because if I tried to spawn them in up here, they'd just be killed by Aethana's boss ability anyway. I think I could have made it work, but then I would have been opening up Actus to being damaged here instead, which I didn't particularly want. So things are a bit awkward. I thought just using Conqueror mode here, not trying to get 5 summons out, was just playing it safe. I mean, this map is so kind of cluttered anyway that I think having 5 Skitari out wouldn't even present much of an advantage anyway, because not all of them would be able to get over to the boss and actually attack her. So now it's just going to be a case of getting a few attacks out. Moving my characters to safety where I can. And once again, I will lure Aethana over to attack the spore mine. And by putting the spore mine here, I wasn't sure if she was going to attack it from the hex she's currently on, the hex that Ro is standing on, or the hex that this Skitaris is on. So if I'd moved Ro here, she could have ended up moving up where she currently is and then wouldn't have ended up adjacent to him. So by moving Ro in between these 2 hexes, regardless of where she moved to, she ended up adjacent to him at the end of her turn after moving. So once again, no point trying to spawn Skitari in here, so I'll just try and make some more use out of Conqueror mode. I can't really lure Aethana over this way, but just due to the bridges making it hard for my summons to move over to her and get lots of attacks off. It'd be hard even for my characters to get over to her, so I definitely want to keep her in the southern portion of the map where there's a lot of room for them to sort of mass around her. So what I'm going to be doing again is luring her over this way at the end of this turn. But to have Ro adjacent to her in that situation, I'm going to need to put him in the line of fire, but luckily he is tough enough to survive a hit from her boss ability. So now I'm going to put a spore mine here, so it won't be killed by her ability, and the only hex that she'll be able to attack it from is this one here, which will bring her adjacent to Ro. Now, in this turn, I really made quite a grave error. Obviously, I wanted to move Ro out of the way of the ability, but I think I was too hasty in moving him. Well, I did need to move him out of the way to make way for my other characters, but I just made a bad decision in where to put him. So by putting him here, she kind of has to stay in position. Otherwise, she can only either stay in position or move onto this hex. Otherwise, she will break contact with Ro. I think what I should have done here was move Actus to where Tan is, put Tan onto this hex, switched Tan over to Protector mode. Then I could have attacked Aethana twice, spawned in 2 new Skitari here and here. And then I could have used the Biovol's active on Aethana to spawn a spore mine where Actus currently is. Now, at the beginning of the next turn, the only spot she would have been able to attack that spore mine from would be the spot where she is currently located, so she would have just stayed in position. I think my problem with that was I was afraid of Actus being killed by the combination of her ability and then her attacking him from high ground, but with Tan in protector mode adjacent to Actus, I think that would have given him enough protection for that to not be a worry. And regardless, even if Actus had died, I still think that would have been less disastrous than what ends up happening here. So whichever way you slice it, what I did here was a bad move, and I think I should have done as I said, which was spawn in those extra Skitari just for the next turn to make sure I can get lots of attacks against Aethana. What I did here instead was I put a spore mine in this location, and I hoped that Aethana would move to this hex in order to attack it, but I think because of the contamination on the hex, she instead decided to move to this one, which broke contact with Ro and cost me a lot of damage. Let's just try and get through this a bit quicker actually, because this isn't particularly interesting. It's just got a few hits to get through. But yeah, that's all I have to really say in terms of strategy. The last turn is just me scrabbling to get some damage on her. It didn't go particularly well. But ultimately, I think if I'd done what I said in the penultimate turn, I would have been able to kill her in one attack. As it stands, I didn't quite manage to do it, but you'll see from the amount of damage I scored that I wasn't far off from killing her in one go. So I'll just play out the rest of this battle and you'll see how much health she was left with, and then you'll see how easy it would have been for me to kill her had I not made such a grave error in the turn preceding this one. I use Actus to heal Golgorts here because I couldn't get him to reach Tan, so Golgorts performing 2 attacks was easily the best option for Actus in terms of healing. But yeah, she gets left with 82,000 health, so if I'd performed another 12 attacks against her, that would have drained all of her health. Yeah, that's all I have to say for this.